Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. So I'll ask that everyone please mute for now. And during questions and answer time, towards the middle of our program, we will invite you to unmute and mute again once you've asked your question. I must say I am truly excited about today's event and let you know that the beginning portion of the event will be recorded by Westwood Media Center and will be up for viewing later this evening. There are a few people that I would like to thank and acknowledge. Superintendent Emily Parks and School Committee Chair Carol Lewis, thank you for your leadership and support of this event. Assistant Superintendent Allison Borchers, thank you for your continued support in all things. Principal Davenport, thank you for being a thought partner for this event and for many others. I also want to thank Rob Goldman and the 4 high school students who will be providing us with musical selections this afternoon. We are honored to have our keynote speaker, Michael Curry, with us today. I ask that all of us participating in today's event honoring the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King do that by, 1, having an open mind, being willing to lean into discomfort at times, and agree to take on one actionable step. After we hear from Mr. Curry, we will have an opportunity to reflect as a community in small groups. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech is definitely his most famous. However, my favorite was delivered on April 3rd, 1968. Yes, the day before his assassination in Tennessee. It's the I've Been to the Mountaintop speech that was given at Bishop Charles Mason Temple. He says, quote, "Let us rise up with a greater readiness. Let us stand with a greater determination, and let us move on in these powerful days, these days of challenge to make America what it ought to be. We have an opportunity to make America a better nation, and I want to thank God once more for allowing me to be here with you." And so I thank all of you for participating in honoring Dr. King's legacy this afternoon.
For those of you who don't know me, I'm Emily Parks. I'm the superintendent of schools. And as superintendent, it is really wonderful for me to welcome all of you here today, even if here is in a virtual environment. I want to thank you for being part of this program and for being here with us. Today's program is sponsored by the Westwood Public Schools METCO program, and I want to extend my thanks to Latifa Frank, Westwood's METCO director, for organizing this event. We are very lucky to have Latifa's leadership and to have her in our community. So thank you, Latifa. I also want to thank Carol Lewis, chair of the school committee, Maya Plotkin, Amanda Phillips, Tony Mullen, and Charlie Donahue from the Westwood School Committee for joining us here today. And I'd like to recognize our town administrator, Christopher Coleman, for joining us. The immediate impetus for this event, of course, is to pause and acknowledge and celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. There are many possible ways for a community to do that through the arts, through song, like we just experienced together, through shared service, through reflections or vigils. Our plan today is to honor that legacy by doing what schools do best, by learning together, with the belief that education, understanding history, opportunities for perspective taking are critical pieces to realizing social justice. Over the last several months, our country has come up hard against the truth that history and progress do not follow a straight, uninterrupted trajectory. The protests for racial justice this past spring and summer, spurred by the unjust treatment of Americans like George Floyd, the undeniable rise in public displays of hate and white nationalism, a pandemic that is disproportionately impacting Black and Brown people, the struggle this week to hang on to the notion so vital in a democracy of a peaceful transition of power are forcing some important reckonings. And yet, at the very same time, Raphael Warnock, who preaches at Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King Jr. once served, becomes a US Senator. He began his acceptance speech by reminding us the other day that, quote, because this is America, the 82-year-old hands that used to pick somebody else's cotton went to the polls and picked her youngest son to be a United States Senator. And on Wednesday, Kamala Harris will be the first woman, a Black woman, and a woman of Indian descent, to be sworn in as Vice President. And she will be sworn in by Sonia Sotomayor using Thurgood Marshall's Bible. Our speaker today, Mr. Michael Curry, is going to help us think about our present circumstances by looking at the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and thinking about the present within the cyclical themes of our history. Michael Curry sits on the NAACP Board of Directors and was recently reappointed to the National NAACP's Executive Committee and appointed to chair the National Board's Advocacy and Policy Committee and vice chair the Political Action and Legislation Committee. He has been serving as the Senior Vice President and General Counsel, Government Affairs and Public Policy of the newly formed Government Affairs and Public Policy Division at the Massachusetts League of Community Health Centers. In 2019, Mr. Curry became the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the organization. I'm very excited that we have this opportunity to learn together. As Latifa mentioned, after Mr. Curry's talk, we'll have time to talk in breakout groups, to reflect on his remarks, and to think about the implications for us as a community, as individuals, and as a school system committed to integration and equity. I'm looking forward to having that conversation with all of you. So without further ado, Mr. Curry, we really appreciate your being here today. Welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just get a thumbs up if you can hear me. I want to make sure that the sound is good. Thank you. Let me share a screen and we'll get started. Okay, excellent. So I want to say good afternoon to all of you in Westwood. I want to start by thanking the superintendent, the members of the school committee, its chair, the principal and Latifa, Frank, for having me today. This is sort of a strange day for me. I was choked up much of this morning. This morning at 11 o'clock, Boston hosted its 51st annual MLK celebration here in Boston, which we typically have in person at the convention center. I've been attending that event for many years. I was a young kid who used to attend that event and always dreamed that one day I'd have a message to share, that I would be asked to participate in that program. Today was that day. I had an opportunity before the thousands of hundreds, if not thousands of folks who participated in that program to share a message. So I followed that presentation this morning with a conversation with you. And that's how I'd like to identify our conversation today. It will be a conversation. I'll show a few slides, I'll share some perspective, and I'm looking forward to the back and forth with you. This is an exciting time right now, and as scary and uncertain as the time is, the exciting part is in my many years of doing civil rights advocacy, I've never received this many calls from school departments, from corporations, from towns like Westwood that are saying, we want you to come in along with many others and talk about race and have an open, frank dialogue about how we got here. And I think that that's the encouraging part in all of what we've experienced in the last year is that people are finally willing to have that conversation. So that's what I hope we'll do today. So as was introduced, I am now the president and CEO of the Massachusetts League of Community Health Centers, organizations, health centers that were born out of the civil rights movement. I represent the 52 community health centers across Massachusetts, serving 98% of the zip codes in the Commonwealth, and they represent 314 practice sites. Over 1 million patients get their care in community health centers. I'm also a member of the nation's oldest, largest civil rights organization, and I serve on the national board. I'm honored as we talk about these civil rights legends, these folks who were students of Dr. King, who marched with Dr. King, and I get to sit next to them several times a year at a board meeting. And I will tell you, as a student of history, I soak all that history up. I ask questions, I listen intently, and I've been honored and humbled to meet some legendary folks like Julian Bond, one of the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who knew Dr. King, who was friends with John Lewis, who knew John Lewis, God bless his soul, who recently passed away. So I'm going to share a little bit as we talk through this history with you. The title, Race Matters, Historical Perspective on Inequities in Education. I'll start here because I think that's the most important conversation as we sort of leap back and forth between history and where we are. There's a term we call the weathering effect in research. The weathering effect means that, as an example, researchers came in and asked Black parents to rate their kids' asthma from 1 to 10. I had asthma as a kid growing up. And mothers, like my mother, rated those kids' asthma 4, 5s, and 6. Then the doctors came in and evaluated those same kids and evaluated them as 8, 9s, and 10s. That means that they had severe asthma. And the researchers in presenting this concept of the weathering effect to us was introducing us to, you can get so used to taking the pump every day like I did, or taking the pill, or being in the emergency room like I was at Boston Medical Center, or the old Boston City Hospital, so frequently that it becomes your normal. You become weathered to being sick. So I extend that conversation about weathering when I'm talking to African Americans and people of color. Have you been weathered to the fact that your aunts and uncles and cousins die of diabetes and heart disease and almost every disease we can name at a higher rate? Are you weathered to attending schools that don't give you an adequate, equitable education and not having the same books, the same resources, the same study abroad programs? Are you weathered to getting stopped by the police or arrested or incarcerated or shot? Are you weathered to walking into a store and purchasing something and them asking you for your ID with your credit card, but they didn't ask the 2 people in front of you? I ask people all the time, what are you weathered to? Because none of it is normal. We can address all those issues, but we become weathered to it. So I ask you, as you look at the screen right now, are you weathered to 93 million people, cases worldwide, with over 2 million deaths from COVID-19? So as we get in this conversation about education, you can't have that without understanding the context, the society in which we're in. People are dying, disproportionately Black and brown, across the globe. Over 23 million cases here in the United States with over 394, almost 395 deaths. Don't get weathered to that. Over 448 cases here in Massachusetts with over 13,000 deaths. And you'll see there the racial disparities that play out. No surprise. There's a phrase in the African-American community that we've had for generations, and if you're African-American on this call, and maybe people of color generally, you'll remember this phrase. They say, when white America catches the cold, Black America catches the flu. And they use that in the context of economics. We're talking about unemployment rates, 2-3 times the unemployment rate of white Americans. We're talking about opportunity or the lack of opportunity. The challenges are 2-3 times greater for African Americans. Businesses failing, housing insecurity, food insecurity. The data bears all of that out. So I ask you, what are you weathered to when you look at this slide, the pandemic's racial disparity? The larger number of Black and brown citizens that are sick, that are infected and dying of COVID-19. When white America catches the cold, Black America catches the flu. What happens when white America catches COVID-19? And the data is telling us that answer. Race for a cure. Just a quick slide on where we are. This is a troubling time. We know that as we talk about a vaccine and Moderna and Pfizer, the challenge is many Black citizens and brown citizens are hesitant to take a vaccine, but you may not know why. So I want to introduce you to that before we get into where we are today and where we've been. I need you to know about Dr. Marion Sims during slavery, who, one of many doctors, became the father of gynecology. He experimented on Black women slaves. I need you to do your research and dig in on the exploitation, experimentation on Black slaves for generations during the institution of slavery. I need you to move forward into Reconstruction in the early 20th century to talk about the denial of healthcare leading up to my generation, the early 60s and 70s, with the implementation of Medicare and Medicaid that forced the integration of our hospitals. I need you to understand that history, as we talk about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment that went on for decades, where Black men were said to be getting medical care, but they were not getting care. They were part of a syphilis experiment that just watched them suffer, that did not provide them, unethically did not provide them medical care for generations through the early 1970s. I need you to know about a report that came out in 2002 called Unequal Treatment. Now, when I was a kid and I walked around Lynching Street housing projects, which was a poor community, ravaged by poverty, crime, drug addiction in the 60s, early 70s. And I remember many of the Black parents would say, doctors don't treat us the same. They don't give us the same medications. They amputate our legs and our limbs when there's another course of treatment. They don't follow up with us. They don't treat us the same. And people would sort of shuffle by that that's just conspiracy theory until the Institute of Medicine put out a report in 2002 called Unequal Treatment that validated that doctors and institutions weren't treating Black and brown citizens the same. The data bore that out. So I asked the question, how did we get here? As we now see Black and brown citizens dying at a higher rate. Now I want to go into Carter G. Woodson, the founder of Negro History Week, now Black History Month. We will get ready to celebrate as we enter February. He said, history was not the mere gathering of facts. The object of historical study is to arrive at a reasonable interpretation of the facts. That's Carter G. Woodson, the writer of Miseducation of the Negro. I want you to do your own study. So as we walk through things today, I'm inviting you, encouraging you to take the opportunity, even after this presentation, to dig in, research, look it up yourself. Because we have a challenge in America right now with the facts. Who knows what the facts are? You can figure out what the facts are. I need you to do that research. And I would ask you to do some of this study. So I'm going to start here. Again, as we talk about the pandemic, I need you to know about the Spanish flu, known as the 1918 flu pandemic, unusually deadly influenza pandemic that lasted from January 1918 to December 1920, infecting 500 million worldwide. We were in the middle of a war, and it was even spread further by the fact that we were in a war and there was traveling between countries by those soldiers. Over 250,000 of the world's population with 5 million deaths. I don't want those numbers to be lost on you. 5 million deaths. 675,000 here in the US. So all the COVID deniers, all the people who don't want to wear masks or socially distance, I need to introduce you to the fact that not only is this real, but it's disparately impacting Black and brown people just like it did in 1918. We hadn't yet discovered a flu virus. We didn't have lab tests to detect it, no vaccines. We had poor infrastructure and life-saving tools, but we were also just a few decades out of slavery. And we were in the midst of the institution of Jim Crow. There were deplorable living conditions for many African Americans across this country that got access to health care. African Americans were extremely susceptible to the outbreak. And similar to today, we lived in congested households. We didn't have the access that we needed to supplies. We couldn't stock up on supplies. And we were definitely sick, and in many cases dying at a higher rate in the spring of 1918. In August of 2019, we recognized the 400-year anniversary of slavery in America. I know we have this reluctance in America to revisit history, but that's the problem we have, is we try to have these conversations around racial bias, around justice, diversity, equity, but we don't go back to the beginning. I do a presentation probably 3 times a week I call Quantum Leap. Now, for those of you who are probably in your 40s, you might remember a TV show from the late 1980s, early 1990s called Quantum Leap, where the white male character would jump through time, and he would jump into the body and the circumstances of an individual, and he had to resolve or address whatever that person had to in that moment. In that presentation, I present the character in Quantum Leap as he jumps into, in 1989, the body of a Ku Klux Klan member and the body of an African-American man that was about to be hung. And that character in Quantum Leap in 1989 had to resolve that life. So in that presentation, I asked attendees and audiences to quantum leap through history. That I need you to be on that ship with the 20 or so odd Negroes who arrived in Virginia in 1619. I need you to understand the institution of slavery that actually started before this, but this is the first documented arrival of slaves in Virginia and at that time, the colonies. I need you to understand that they were titled indentured servants, but there was no end date on their servitude. Unlike white indentured servants, they were always slaves. I need you to understand the institution of slavery. As you see the transatlantic slave trade, that image on the bottom right-hand corner, those many African-American men, African men and women who were transported across the Atlantic Ocean. You can't have a conversation about education and equity without starting here. We didn't get here by accident. I need you to know that there were some 250 rebellions on those slave ships, Africans who tried to free themselves. I need you to know about the institution of slavery here in this country as we sold families, broke families up for generations. I know this is hard. I know our history books, our history classes only touch on this stuff, a paragraph, a class or two. That was never enough. And it was never enough because as we quantum leap back in today, if you want to talk about why African Americans are dropping out at higher rates, why we die of almost every disease at a higher rate, why we don't own homes at a higher rate as white Americans, why I can go down the list. Shame on you if you think it's because we're Black or brown, or we don't have work ethic, or we don't have aspirations and dreams. Shame on you if you've not connected the dots to this history. That's the purpose of this conversation. How did we get here? And you can't starting that conversation without going with slavery. So the transatlantic slave trade. We have no idea the magnitude of slavery across the globe. And as you'll see in the transatlantic slave trade here, across the Americas. So I want to just give you a picture as we talk about slavery in North America and here in this country. I want you to see how many slaves were transported into the West Indies, into Central America, and to South America. We have not even cracked the surface on explaining that history and what it did to the continent of Africa, to the people of Africa, to the cultures in those places that slaves were imported into, to the cruelty, the abuse, the neglect, the disease, and the education inequality that was put on those populations that were transported. I know this is tough, but I need you to be bold and willing to have that conversation that we for generations have avoided having. Here in Boston, we had a debate about 2 years ago about putting up a monument, or not a monument, but an art exhibit that would have shown a slave auction block in Faneuil Hall. You need to know the history of Faneuil Hall. As you walk through Faneuil Hall, and you attend this, you go into the shops and you partake and you may watch some entertainment outside. I need you to know the slave history of Faneuil Hall. And the art exhibit was almost ready to be put up, and then Black and brown citizens protested because they didn't want to be triggered walking through Faneuil Hall with their families and being reminded of the Institute of Slavery. Now, here's what's important. We need to know this history, but this was about African Americans and others saying, we want to tell you how we want to tell our story and where our story should be. And that's what you'll see here in Auction Block. I want to talk a little bit about slave crimes, crime and punishment under slavery. Slaves had faced harsh penalties for their crimes, but slaves committed crimes. The law sometimes had to subvert the property rights of masters in order to preserve slavery as a social institution. Slave crimes included violating curfew, attending religious meetings without a master's consent, and running away. And you'll see there, during the era of slavery in the United States, the education of enslaved African Americans, except for religious instruction, was discouraged and eventually made illegal in most southern states. Those people who created slavery understood what education meant. Slave owners considered Black literacy a threat to the institution of slavery and their financial investment in it. As one North Carolina statute stated, teaching slaves to read and write tends to excite dissatisfaction in their minds and to produce insurrection and rebellion. Southern states erected numerous punishments for crime. Just in case you don't know the brutality of crime, I need you to study it. I need you to challenge your professors, your teachers in college or there in Westwood. You want to dig in on this stuff and bring that knowledge back to the classroom. Reconstruction. I call Reconstruction the Obama years. All those years of slavery through Emancipation Proclamation and eventually the passage of the 13th Amendment. Reconstruction was that exciting time that African Americans thought, wow, we are free. Many were free, many were not. And I'll explain that. But the Obama years, I describe it as Reconstruction, as people thought, wow, there's opportunity. We're going to get 40 acres and a mule. We have an opportunity to get education. We can own our own lands. We can educate our own families and build our own communities. And there was a period of time where there was so much hope and potential in that time, but history repeats itself. The past is prologue. Whenever there's a rapid advancement in justice and equality and human rights, there's always a backlash. That's not only our history here in this country, that's a history across the globe. There's always a backlash to progress. Reconstruction was a period of time, 1865 to 1877, after the Civil War, where attempts were made to redress the inequities of slavery and its political, social, and economic legacy to solve the problems arising from a readmission to the Union of the 11 states that had seceded at or before the outbreak of war. Sweeping changes in America's political life, from new laws, including constitutional amendments, dealing with freedom and citizenship, significantly altered systems in the definition of American citizenship. During Reconstruction, some 2,000 African Americans held public office, way before Kamala Harris, way before Ayanna Pressley, way before some of these names and figures that we're seeing today. There was a surge of Black men entering Congress, becoming sheriffs in local departments, taking seats in legislatures across the country. From the local level all the way up, politically mobilized Black people joined with white allies to bring the Republican Party, yes, then the Republican Party, the radical Republicans that brought all of this advancement and opportunity. Civil War victory opened a door to the 13th Amendment, formally abolishing the practice of slavery in the U.S. After emancipation, ex-slaves had little to no formal education, no financial means, no property, no residence, keys to economic independence. Those are the social mobility rungs on the ladder. You need an education, you need a job, you need those opportunities. Special Order number 15 offered the 40 acres and a mule. Slaves were forced into other forms of slavery, introducing you to the term debt peonage. And I give the example of, imagine you're on a plantation and you're told you're now free. But they say to you, but by the way, you owe me, the slave owner, X amount of dollars because you've been living on the property for generations. and now you're in debt to me, and you can't leave until you pay off that debt. That was another form of slavery, well after Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. Sharecropping, tenant farming, convict leasing, lending you back to, using the criminal justice system to incarcerate you, and then lending you back to those same plantations, those same owners. So I need you to do your own research. I'm only touching, this is quantum leap. We're just jumping back and forth in time. You have to do this research. Black codes, laws intended to restrict freedom of African Americans and to maintain the availability of cheap labor force after slavery was abolished. So there was not a quick celebration that slavery was over, because there was a backlash to opportunity, to the freedom. Often the codes required former slaves to sign yearly labor contracts. Refusing to sign could result in arrests, fines, or forced into unpaid labor. In 1865, Mississippi and South Carolina enacted the first Black codes. Mississippi's law required Blacks to have written evidence of employment for the coming year. Some of the faces in what I call the Obama years: Hiram Revel, many of these African-American men who were prominent Black men who then ascended into halls of power across the country, and then particularly in Congress, and the indignities that they had to endure, the disrespect they had to endure by their colleagues, the hate, the violence that they had to deal with during that time period. Still untapped history. Then the backlash, the sort of convening of the so-called whiteness to be the backlash to the fear of Black power. We're not talking the 1960s, we're talking the end of the 19th century. That the little progress that was made, there was a backlash to that. There was a connecting with other white leaders to say, I know you may agree in freeing the slaves, but you should be afraid of the power they have. And that was used as a motive appeal to pull people in who should have had a compass around this stuff, who knew that it didn't feel right, that treating other people based on race was not a good thing to do, was not a Christian thing to do, but they did it anyway because they got bought up and caught up into this notion of whiteness. The political cartoon by Thomas Nash, published in Harper's Weekly, September 5th, 1868. You'll see that image. Depicted standing atop a Black Civil War veteran are a 5 Points Irishman, Ku Klux Klan founder Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Wall Street financier and Democrat August Belmont. The campaign for whiteness. Then as all of the pillars of Reconstruction and all that opportunity started to be pulled away, you had Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, was a landmark decision by the US Supreme Court that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation laws for public facilities, as long as segregated facilities were equal in quality, a doctrine that came to be known as separate but equal. That was devastating for Black leaders. That was devastating for folks who were fighting for equal justice, equal opportunity, and the end of that century. As we turn that century and enter the 20th century, lynchings was the tool. Almost 5,000 lynchings across the country between 1835 and 1964. Violence was the tool of oppression for much of this country's history. And you'll see there the 4,000 plotted across the country, particularly in the South. Many of them African Americans, some of them even white citizens. We know with the birth of the NAACP, the Springfield race riot in 1908, 2 Black men were accused of attacks on white women. They were put into jail. This was the birthplace, Springfield, Illinois, the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, where they would have celebrated Abraham Lincoln. This was sort of a Black Wall Street at that period of time. Black people had businesses, they had some success, but those 2 Black men who were accused of attacks on white women were then put in jail as thousands of protesters marched on that prison to lynch those 2 Black men. And thank God for a civil rights social justice compass, right? No matter what color you are, you have that compass in you. But it's not your gut. I'm not talking about your gut. I'm talking about a compass. That comes from reading. That comes from listening. That comes from being critical about what you hear and what you take in. And they had a compass in 1908. a white businessman and a white sheriff moved those two black men out of town. And when those townspeople found out that they had been moved, they then went on a rampage killing black, and I think some white citizens were killed. I think it's the largest number of white citizens killed in a race riot in this country's history. This too is America. That's our history. Birth of a Nation. I won't spend much time on here, but I want you to do two things as a homework assignment. I want you to watch the original D.W. Griffith film, 1915, a racist Ku Klux Klan propaganda film. So we get talking about busing in Boston in the late 1960s through early 1970s. You'll understand why people didn't feel comfortable with their kids sitting next to a black child in their classroom. As we talk about the Little Rock Nine, you'll understand why racism was so embedded in this country's history that people were willing to be violent to prevent those black people from sitting in the same classroom as my child. But you can't get there without quantum leaping back into 1915 with Birth of a Nation, where all those tropes, those stereotypes of African-American people and African-American men were perpetuated through and pushed through this film, D.W. Griffith film, the first film of its kind to ever be shown at the White House under Woodrow Wilson. The battle that took place here in Boston as Mayor Curley and others were, this was one of the major cities that was going to show the film, and 10,000 black citizens marched on downtown Boston to shut down that film, led by the Boston NAACP and William Monroe Trotter, willing to disrupt the film. And yes, the film aired and it aired to great acclaim across the country. Best film of its time. Grand spectacles, large cast members, representing the Civil War. And that the outcome of that film is so embedded in the DNA of this country that even generations later, it still has an impact on how we see each other. Red Summer, as we talk about Baltimore, as we talk about Ferguson, I need you to know about Red Summer in 1919, where soldiers had returned from war and they thought the Harlem Hellfighters you see in the bottom right-hand corner, they thought, hey, we just fought for our country. We should be treated as equal citizens. They returned to communities across the country. As you see in the top right, the race riots, the massacres that happened, not just at Black Wall Street in Tulsa, but Elaine, Arkansas, Washington, D.C., and Rosewood, Florida, and East St. Louis, many more that are not even plotted on this map, where Black and brown citizens were murdered, their communities burned out of racial hatred and animus. And soldiers had to take up arms to defend their communities, and many were killed. Brown v. Board of Education, as we quantum leap, we're in the middle of the 20th century. You had people like Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall, and many others who had been crafting a legal strategy to challenge Plessy v. Ferguson, a series of cases leading up, because they understood that it was about lunch counters. It was about school systems. It was about healthcare, that the barriers, the taint of race in our overall social structure was keeping African Americans and others from the opportunities. Teachers couldn't teach, like many of the teachers on this call today who are white had an opportunity to take seats in education opportunities that African American teachers at the middle of this century could not have. That African American doctors couldn't have in our healthcare systems. That African American patients couldn't get cares in our hospital through the middle end of the 1960s. And it took a team led by Thurgood Marshall and others to lead us to a moment of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Here's the problem. Problem is you can pass a law, but you can't get people to do the right thing. Sometimes that takes generations. So even though as they did their work to get the Brown v. Board of Education and to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson, separate is inherently unequal. It took us from 1954 to 1972 when I was sitting on those buses as a kid, going from Roxbury to Charlestown as a part of busing. A case brought by the Boston NAACP to challenge the inequity of education. Now, of course, if you know this history, particularly for those who are older, it was about poor white kids and poor Black and brown kids not having opportunity, but it was also about poor Black kids who didn't even have that opportunity that poor white kids had. Because of the power structure and how we wield power in this country, it relegated Black children, Roxbury, Southside Chicago, St. Louis, North Minneapolis, go across the country, Miami. It relegated them to a second-class status that included their education systems. Horrible books, horrible facilities they would get their education in. I often say this comment, and then I want to get a time check. I often say this comment that there's a little girl right now sitting in Roxbury or sitting in Cabrini Greens in Chicago, which is a housing development, who's meant to find a cure for cancer. That is what she's put on this earth to do. She has a cure for cancer in her. If she has the academic rigor, if she has the right teacher supports, the right family structure, right community supports, but we'll never know her. You and I will never know her because she doesn't have that academic rigor like you do. She doesn't have that opportunity like you do. I introduced you to Dr. Corbett, the woman who was a part of the team to discover COVID-19 vaccine. I'm thankful she had the opportunity. But there are many Dr. Corbetts who could lead the city of Boston. 200-year history of the city of Boston with mayors. Every single one of those mayors has been a white man. Now, I don't know what your reaction is to that, but I need you to take that in for a second. Every mayor in the history of the city of Boston has been a white man. So what does that mean? That means we left talent on the table. Women, people of color who might have a different vision on construction, on housing, on education, on healthcare, have never been able to sit at the table to lead the city, to offer their brilliance, their talent, because of racism. You don't have to be American to be African-American to be frustrated and irritated by that. We need everyone to take that. America's given the Negro Check, Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. That's Dr. King. That's Dr. King's speech, as we know the modern civil rights movement, but that check is still not come back marked insufficient funds in 2021. As we see many African Americans marching along the streets with their white allies and allies of all races saying, no justice, no peace. I can't breathe. As we get gaslighted to turn our televisions on and see these images of law enforcement engaging with Black male and females and saying, wow, he didn't resist arrest. She didn't deserve to die. And no one's held accountable. That must tear us up inside. Anybody of conscience, that must tear us up inside, because you know that's not justice. That's not what the framers of our Constitution intended when they talked about justice, when they talked about equal protection. Maybe when they sat down, they didn't necessarily think of it as African Americans, but they built a framework and they built these principles, and yet we can't still deliver it in 2021. So I think as African Americans say, make America great again, and we get frustrated with that because when has America been as great as it could be? It wasn't in 1776. It wasn't in 1863. It wasn't in 1963 when those kids marched on downtown Birmingham, or 1960 when young leaders like Congressman Lewis took to the streets the Freedom Rides to desegregate lunch counters and desegregate public transportation. If you're young and you're on this call, I want you to know about this day called the Children's Crusade, D-Day, May 2nd, 1963. Birmingham campaign was going on at the time. The beginning of 1963 was a movement organized by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. King and his movement, Ralph Abernathy, to bring attention to the integration efforts of African Americans in Birmingham, Alabama. They call Birmingham Bombingham, where my mother's from. She was here in Birmingham during this time. They knew that pushing back on segregation could mean your life. It was known for its fierce defense of segregation. The Children's Crusade began on May 2nd, 1963, when thousands of children trained in the tactics of nonviolence. That's not what we saw in the US Capitol recently. We're talking about nonviolence when those many young people marched on downtown Birmingham to challenge segregation and meet with leadership. They left 16th Street Baptist Church, headed throughout the city to protest segregation peacefully. Progress would be made because it shocked the conscience of the nation to see dogs being sicked on children, fire hoses, high-powered fire hoses being put on young people. So if you were a white person sitting somewhere in Des Moines, Iowa, or Newton, Massachusetts, or Westwood, and you saw those images, it woke you up to say, I gotta show up now. I gotta speak up. I gotta be an ally for justice. The backdrop of America's healthcare system, our education system, is all these images we see play out. Look up Time magazine's cover with Amadou Diallo, who was killed in New York by police violence. Laquan McDonald, one that breaks my heart, Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old boy who was playing with a toy gun in a park in Cleveland, like I used to play in Washington Park in Boston, now Malcolm X Park, and I'd run around, or Derby Park, and I'd pretend I was cops and robbers or cowboys and Indians, as historically inappropriate as that is today, as we know now have a better consciousness. But I would play, and imagine if a police officer pulled up within a few feet of you, and without any question, without any conversation, he shoots you. What was Tamir Rice meant to do? What contribution to society was Tamir Rice meant to bring us that we will never realize? Say their names. Know their faces, know their stories. Don't be so triggered and traumatized by what we're experiencing. Don't be so weathered to what we're experiencing that you don't look into it yourself. The education system, and I'll end it on this, the education system is a challenge. Disparate discipline, Black and brown citizens, young boys, kids that are getting expelled, suspended from schools across the country. The school to prison pipeline is real. Young Black boys and girls who get put from schools into our penal system, they get incarcerated, and there's no intervention to find them the supports they need. I can't tell you the number of kids I grew up with who had addictions at a time they had no empathy. And now they're serving mandatory minimums because they didn't have the social supports, the substance abuse intervention, and the school systems that would provide the support and network that they needed. That is our history. This too is America. I remind people all the time of a phrase that I love: if you're not at the table, you're on the table, or you're on the menu. So I ask you in Westwood, we need you to be at the table. Whether it's calling in on a radio show or showing up at the school committee hearing or challenging your school system to have a full version of American history, not the diminished version that we've been all operating off of. Willing to have tough conversations and engage in dialogue. If we don't, we're doomed to repeat the same failures of the past. And then the quote that I'm often known for: it takes time for truth to catch up to history. COINTELPRO, J. Edgar Hoover, the Black Panthers, Malcolm X, the targeting of Dr. King. There's so much on history that we have yet to wrap. Nat Turner. There's so much we have to understand about Black women's presence and power in this movement, and we haven't even cracked the surface yet. So there lies the challenge for Westwood. If you want to address education inequality, if you want to make opportunity, not just for students in Westwood, but you want to be the spark that leads this movement across the nation, you got to start within. You got to pick up Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Isabel Wilkerson's recent book on caste, or Warmth of Other Suns. You got to dig in on white fragility. You got to start reading and learning and challenging and asking and debating and sharing. Otherwise, we're doomed to repeat it. Past is prologue. We're in the years after the Obama years. This is where white supremacy and white nationalists have feel empowered to sack the Capitol. Not that everyone that was there was a nationalist or everyone there was a neo-Nazi, but they found cover in that crowd, in that movement. That was the violence of the end of the 19th century and much of the violence of the 20th century. This is not news stories. we got to do something and address these inequalities. And on Dr. King's Day, as we celebrate his life and legacy, I'm urging you, dig into his philosophy, dig into all this history, and then make that a part of your life and your work. Thank you.
Wow, so many powerful nuggets. At this time, we're going to turn on questions. And so Allison Borchers and I will do our best to monitor the chat. And also, if you want to raise your hand, we will acknowledge you. The first question that we do have, Mr. Curry, from someone on the call is, who are some of the people that inspire you today? Are there any people who our children may want to pay a special attention to?
So there are so many, and I'd probably be doing an injustice to try to name a few because I'm inspired by so many civil rights leaders. I'm a student of the NAACP. You know, I was a kid who grew up and understood that that oldest and largest civil rights organization that was founded by, just in case you didn't know this history, a white woman, Mary White Ovington, William English Walling, a white man who wrote an article about that 1908 race riot called Race War in the North, teamed up with W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, prominent African-American leader, way before Rosa Parks had resisted giving up her seat. All of this history is something we haven't tapped into. I tap into Frederick Douglass, Du Bois, Dr. King, Diane Nash, Sojourner Truth. I tap into all of them every day to do this work for civil rights because I know their story. Frederick Douglass, one of my favorites of all time. Read about Frederick Douglass. Read the speech he gave, recognizing the 4th of July and paying tribute to, in some way, Abraham Lincoln, but being critical of Abraham Lincoln. One of the top 50 speeches of all time. Take the time and dissect that speech. I also have people I look up to, not look up to, but people who helped shape my path in life in this work. I was a kid in Roxbury who went to a community where I was a housing project. I went to bad schools, and my sister was a crack addict. My mother was, a housekeeper for a wealthy family in Chestnut Hill, Mass. So we didn't see her from 8 in the morning until 8 p.m. at night. We were latchkey kids in a housing project. And I watched my sisters decline into drugs and gangs and violence. I watched the people around me, and I kept saying, what is wrong with us? Then I go visit family in Rochester, New York, or Buffalo, or Alabama, Birmingham, Tuscaloosa. And I said, wow, this is us everywhere. We're poor, we're sick, we're incarcerated. And it wasn't until I left my community in Roxbury and went to Minneapolis, St. Paul, little small liberal arts college, Macalester College, that I got to understand the community I had come from. And I learned about mass incarceration. I learned about restrictive covenants that didn't allow us to buy homes in white communities. I learned about redlining that didn't offer us the same financial opportunities to build wealth. I learned about the GI Bill, where many soldiers came back and were able to tap the GI Bill to get access to the middle class, that pipeline. This was the too big to fail, the airlines, the agriculture, the farmers. And all these paths to the middle class that did not provide the same opportunity for African Americans. I took all of that in and then came back and had local activists like Mel King and Sarah Ann Shaw from Channel 4, the reporter, and others that pour into me their history, their local challenges, their passion for movements and change. And that's where I get my motivation from. And those are some of my sheroes and heroes.
Thank you.
We have one in the chat, Latifa. Can I share that?
Yes.
This is from Kate LaCroix. She says her son would like to know at what age, Mr. Curry, you became active in the NAACP and in anti-racism activities.
So I think it's a good question. So I think as a kid, I didn't understand it all. So I internalized it, right? That's the Black kid who says, well, I talk with good English, so they think I'm acting white. And you would say to yourself, but why are we giving away English to white people? Why are we giving away, success is white, that's not Black? Why is nice homes and picket fences and 2 cars and a cat and a dog the image of white families and not black families? I didn't understand all of that. I like many people of color, probably internalized it. That wasn't for us. Good hair, kinky hair, bad hair, good hair. Our bodies, right? Black men, women with our shapes, that it wasn't as attractive because of Essence, not Essence, black magazines even perpetuated some of that too, but white magazines didn't show our beauty. So I didn't get it. It didn't happen until I sat on that campus in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I had some older black women who were activists who beat it into me. And they would check me on my language, on how I viewed myself, how they said, you know what, stop making apologies when you open your mouth in class. Stop putting disclaimers on everything you say. Stop feeling like you represent your race every time you open your mouth in a room full of white students because it's pressure. Aside from the pressure that we all have when we're students, imagine the pressure of sitting in class like I did, like many of your METCO students do. You're sitting in class, and I know that if I say something with the wrong English, if I answer the question the wrong way, if I don't know, if my answer is wrong, I've let down a people. I've now fit a stereotype. So I became an activist on campus because I had to deal with that conflict that was going on inside of me, and the being active and challenging that is what empowered me. It gave me a voice. So when a teacher would ask me a question, I would challenge that teacher and say, well, actually, that's not the correct history. Or you didn't really, you didn't ask the other students the same question. As I sat on that campus my first week, and the teachers will be terrified by this, from Westwood, sitting in class in McAllister, St. Paul, and the teacher goes around, I think it's about 100 of us in the classroom, and the teacher comes, she said, Jackie, I know you're from St. Paul. Tom, I know you're from Iowa. And he comes to me and he goes, Michael, now I'm one of maybe 2 black students in the whole class, and goes, oh, and I know you're from Roxbury. I want you to talk about gangs and violence. Imagine the spotlight, the weight of what he just did on that moment. Because I was trying to fit in. I just want to be another student. And I think students that are traveling to communities like Westwood and Needham and Norwood, students like myself who travel to Minneapolis, St. Paul, have that weight on them every day on top of every other challenge that comes with being a child. Every other challenge that comes with being on these campuses, these predominant campuses. I need you to hear that. Because if you truly want to do racial justice work, you got to provide the supports, the network, so that they survive, they thrive, and they graduate, and they're successful. We all depend on them surviving and thriving.
Thank you. And we have 3 more questions that we're going to take. And the first one comes from a teacher who is also a parent of young children and wants to know, as a parent, how can she start to help educate her own children in anti-racist practices?
You know, as a parent myself, I have 3 boys. My oldest son is 25. He graduated from St. John's, the second generation to graduate college. I was the first. I have a 18-year-old who's about to graduate from Brockton High School, an honor roll student. And then I have a 12-year-old who is also in Brockton, and he's a straight A student. And I struggle with how much of this history to give them, how much of that quantum leap I wanted them to take. Because one of the things that happens when you take that quantum leap, you get angry. Because you're saying, why didn't I know this? Why didn't anyone tell me this history? Why did I attend Robert E. Lee High School and wear a Robert E. Lee High School jacket and understand that he would have had me not even as a full citizen? Or I was a soldier on the Robert E. Lee military base. Or I ran outside of my home to that musical sound from the ice cream truck that said, nigga want a watermelon, ha, ha, ha. That was the lyrics to that song, that tune that we all ran out to that ice cream truck to. The gaslighting of America. That once you get all of that information in, it traumatizes, it makes you angry. So that's where parents come in. 1, you gotta learn it. 2, you gotta learn it with your children. Listen to it, talk about it, debate it. Unwrap it. Figure out how it's manifesting in your life. Because I can tell you right now, if you are white on this call and you're from Westwood and you think racism doesn't touch you, first of all, you don't know what racism is if you think that. You need to go with the basic definition of racism. Here is the best example why I can tell you racism is manifested in all of our lives. I can introduce you right now to Black and brown kids who think that they can't be doctors, lawyers, and scientists because they're Black. Just like I can introduce you to women who think they can't be a certain thing because they're women. That's when you know that you've internalized racism so much this in your images, your movies, your magazines. It's perpetuated by our teachers, our doctors, our lawyers. All those people we see on television now, angry because they want to make America great again. They're teachers. Like some of you, they're doctors, they're judges, they're lawyers, they're gas station clerks. And they're bringing that racial tension, that racial hatred, that animus, and that ignorance to their jobs. So we need parents and we need students to lift up their consciousness and challenge those things. Be that person in the boardroom that goes, no, this is not an inclusive strategy. We need you to be that 17-year-old on the call now that will be a legislator by the time you're 25 or 30 to say, no, that's not an equitable policy. I'm challenging that policy, that we do this in a better way that makes it an opportunity. We want to deal with food insecurity, housing insecurity, education inequity. And I want to do that from a social justice, civil rights standpoint. But you got to have courage to do that. I'll tell you, it takes courage to challenge authority. It takes courage to be that lone voice in the room to say that this is not right. That's what Dr. King was. So if you take any message from his history, his words, his legacy, it's courage. It takes courage to do this work. Are you going to be courageous? Our mantra in the NAACP is courage will not skip this generation. I repeat it, courage will not skip this generation.
I think I have one. It looks like this one was submitted in advance. This is a doozy. It's the question of why the struggle for Black equality is juxtaposed against support for police.
So it's funny, if there was a thing I left out that I really think we need to address, and I appreciate the question. You know, it always frustrated me when we got into this challenge of Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter. Those were tone deaf responses to Black Lives Matter. Because, and I challenge anyone on this call, anyone on this conversation, they do your own research of the data. We're shot disparately, non-violently incarcerated higher rates for non-violent drug offenses and crimes. We die of almost every disease at a higher rate. I can go down a long list, expelled more, name it. The list is overwhelming, the list of things that inequitably are put on Black and brown people. All of that says to me, Black lives don't matter. That's the reinforced message and all that. If it mattered, you'd treat our disease. If it mattered, you wouldn't over-incarcerate us. If it mattered, you wouldn't shoot us when we had a mental health issue. You wouldn't shoot us because you felt threatened because of our size and our mass and our braids and our baggy jeans, and you thought that that was a threat on your life. I ask you, that's never been acceptable. Why is it acceptable now? So we know cops' lives matter. I would challenge anyone, when a cop gets killed in this country, most of us, Black, brown, white, poor, name it, we mourn the loss for that cop, that police officer, because he or she was trying to save lives, hopefully. But we know that we mourn their loss and we mourn the impact on their families. But I ask the question, when a kid gets shot in Roxbury tomorrow, are you mourning? Are you showing up? When we have unsolved murder rates in Roxbury, Southside, North, Minneapolis, name it, and they're unsolved because we don't put the resources into solving, are you angry? Are you frustrated? When we have higher rates of Black and brown citizens dying of COVID-19, do we say now we need to take this disease seriously and we need to solve those underlying health inequities that have them dying at a high rate? No, we're not doing that. So do Black lives really matter? So you can be a supporter of police, but I have an issue. I don't want to have this blanket deference to law enforcement that when you say that you felt threatened, you get away. Because we know that's way too much power to give any human being, any soldier, any police officer, because that means, and I'll digress to say this, we also know, as FBI data shows us, that law enforcement has been infiltrated by white nationalists. You can't hang us. Where else can you go and carry a gun and kill Black citizens and get away with it? Now, I don't know if that's 2% or 70%, but we've not even cracked the surface to figure out how much racial animus exists in our law enforcement. Then add on top of that, that we don't have diversity in law enforcement, from the FBI down to our local municipal police departments. Why? Veterans preference. Mostly white male veterans come back and get those jobs. Why? Civil service exams that have been crafted in such a way that many African Americans don't end up with those jobs. Hair test samples that Black police officers end up not passing the test because of the composition of our hair. Look it up. So we're having a conversation about this juxtaposition between Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter. We know Blue Lives Matter, but we don't know Black Lives Matter. That's up to us to decide that Black Lives Matter. And that's the work, the why people are marching in the streets today.
And I think the last question that we are going to be able to take this afternoon comes from the chat. I would like to ask Mr. Curry to say more about the resistance in the 1970s Boston area suburbs to including themselves in the busing exchange, turning the issue into a conflict between Boston's neighborhoods.
Well, there's so much packed in that, and there's a documentary that I'll send you that I want you to share with the folks that just came out on the history of busing in Boston. And it talks about Louise Day Hicks, who became the face of the anti-busing movement. It talks about the mayor, the Black community, and the conflict and the tension. It's a fascinating documentary, and I want you all to take the time to listen to it. They interviewed my mother and I for the documentary as well. And we interviewed and shared our story. I don't know if it made the final cut, but the documentary is powerful. We know that when Judge Garrity made that decision, it was about the segregation of Boston public schools. You may not know in Boston that they steer Black and brown citizens away from white housing developments, like Old Colony in South Boston. The Boston Housing Authority, we get very tribal in Boston, as well as across the country. So you had white, Irish, and white Italian citizens who came to this country and who had also been discriminated against. Irish need not apply. Who then became the power structure of a city that whitewashed and did not allow white Irish and immigrants who came here to the potato famine to settle in Boston and were discriminated. Then they perpetuated that same discrimination against the bottom of the barrel, which in this country, you knew that if you got here, no matter when you got here, you were not Black. So as you matriculated into the front door of our schools, of our hospitals, at least you weren't Black. That's not a challenge in struggle. That's history. So you had busing here in Boston. You had a tension with Black activists who are many of my friends and mentors who are challenging the Boston public school system to integrate. And the notion was we had less books and poor quality books, and our schools systems were underfunded. And though even some of those white communities, like the Warren Prescott, I was a kid on the bus, 7 years old, 1974, 6 years old, taking that turn at the Museum of Science and that right turn to go over the bridge to Charlestown and Warren Prescott, ducking down in my seat as I peeked up over the window to see white police officers mostly, and crowds of people throwing rocks at the bus. I don't know if it was everybody, but I knew I couldn't understand, why do they hate us so much that they would hurt children? That's not ancient history. That's a historical minute ago. That's my lifetime. And then you had people in the suburbs who sat quietly by, who felt like that was poor people's battle. Let them hash that out between South Boston and Charlestown and Roxbury and Dorchester or Hyde Park. The problem with us when it comes to issues like busing or racial injustice generally is we don't think it's our issue because we sit home in our own homes and we feel they'll work it out. Let them deal with it. We won't get to a place in this country where democracy works for everyone until we all feel vested in realizing the potential of democracy. And that means weighing in like they should have done during busing. Saying that we need to get those Black and brown children and those white children who weren't getting an education, lift them all up with academic rigor and opportunity. That's not what we did in Boston. Black students entered the school system and white students fled. They went to the suburbs where they once wasn't even allowed or admitted, and left a fractured, weak, frail school system underfunded to then educate a majority of Black and brown students as it exists today. That's the history. I'll share a documentary that I really would encourage all of you to listen to. I guarantee you it will be fascinating so you can see and hear the racial tension, the logic, the illogical arguments that existed during the early part of 1970.
Thank you. Thank you for helping to connect the dots for us this afternoon. Mr. Curry spoke of the weathering effect, or a frog in water analogy. Dr. Olivia Moorhead Slaughter spoke of this to Boston parents a few weeks ago. She stated that if you put a frog in cool water and slowly turn up the heat, the frog will continue to swim in the water, getting used to it until they eventually boil. This is the condition that Black and brown people have been conditioned to live with. The purpose of this afternoon is to get our community to think about the context of the society that we are living in and the impact of that society on our students' education. This reminds me of Ghodri Muhammad's book, Cultivating Genius, where she speaks to the importance of historical literacy as an entrance into culturally relevant pedagogy. We know that we have a lot of work to do and that a lot of work has begun in Westwood. We have to be willing to continue to have conversations about the historical context of racism and education. At the beginning, I asked you to commit to one actionable step. I want to turn the program over to Principal Davenport as we move into working as a community, crafting and sharing our actions as we move forward. I also want to acknowledge Mr. Curry and thank him for speaking with us this afternoon. I know that I was taking copious notes and had so many nuggets of information. If we weren't on Zoom, I'm sure there would be loud applause. There's also, from the chat and from emails, there are many questions and that I think, your talk, Mr. Curry, has sparked an interest in the community, and we have, a lot of next steps right now. So we're excited and eager to get to those. And again, we thank you and we appreciate you.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you to you, particularly Latifa, for having me and the rest of the leadership. Honor and a privilege to join you. I am accessible. So if you shoot me emails to Latifa, I try to answer them, even though I have a new job that takes up my life. But I'll try to answer them. But I'm encouraging you, use this as an opportunity, change our circumstances. And you can start that in Westwood. But we need your voices. We need your leadership. And we need you to prove that courage hasn't skipped this generation. So I want to say thank you to all for having me.